He and I had ties back in our undergraduate days at the Indian Institute of Technology. And in his honor, we're having the series of lectures this spring. And I'm very pleased to have this topic be presented by Ramya Swaminathan. Long duration energy storage, the key to 24/7 renewables. Renewable energy resources have seen a tremendous growth, not only in the United States, but all around the world. In fact, last week, we had wind energy set a new record of more than 10% of supply being provided by wind energy. But there's no doubt these are handicapped by its intermittency, and the key to having dispatchable resources would be to have long duration energy storage. And that's what this topic will be about. And Ramya will be talking about the technology, the company she founded, which is Malta Incorporated. A little bit of background on Ramya. She led the spin out of Malta from Alphabet's Moonshot Factory, which is formerly known as Google X, in 2018, has been the company's CEO since its founding. She has led Malta through multiple rounds of corporate venture funding and has recruited a multidisciplinary team focused on commercializing Malta's thermal storage technology. She serves as a U.S. Department of Energy Clean Energy Education Empowerment Ambassador and appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, to the Electricity Advisory Committee. To advise DOE on modernizing the nation's electricity delivery infrastructure. I was also appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, to the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Committee to advise the Commerce Department. So she was also named a Business Insider's 2020 list of 21 rising stars in clean energy. Before founding Malta as an independent company, Ramya was the CEO of Rye Development, a hydropower development firm that she grew to be the leading developer of new hydropower projects in the United States. She was responsible for the expansion of Rye's platform into energy storage with the addition of 2 sizable pump storage hydro development projects in the US Pacific Northwest. Prior to her work in the hydropower space, she was a public finance banker. Most recently as a director at UBS, where she focused on public power clients and senior managed more than $10 billion in financing. She holds a master's in public policy from the Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government and a BA in anthropology from Amherst College. Welcome, Ramya.
Thank you so much for having me, Rudy. It's a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to certainly telling you a little bit about what we're doing at Malta, about the world of long duration storage, and then of course, look forward to your questions and seeing if I can make a dent in them. So thank you again for having me, really look forward to it. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. I did prepare some slides to share with you today. So please let me know if that's visible.
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect. So thank you, Rudy, for that very kind introduction. So you all know a little bit about my background and where I'm coming from, and so please take those remarks in the context of my own background and what I'm trying to do at Malta. So the first several slides, I think, are going to be of absolutely no surprise to anybody here. But I wanted to draw your attention to the scale of the problem and the fact that we are seeing impact from climate change growing practically in every corner of the world. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, obviously at the United Nations, put out a very alarming headline a little more than a year ago saying that we are at code red for humanity. And the headlines on the right-hand side of this page, some are in the United States and some are focused in other parts of the world, including the European Union, really focus on the fact that it is not limited to any one geography or any one jurisdiction. Now, Rudy shared with you at the beginning in the introductory remarks an absolutely remarkable fact, and one that I think holds one of the keys to us moving to solve this problem, which is that remarkably, renewables are now the cheapest form of generation. So we're going to hold on to that thought And then think about, in the context of that, what are the largest contributors to GHG emissions? The right-hand side pie graph on this page is a global data set, whereas on the left-hand side, you've got a US total. And in the United States, about 25% of GHG emissions can be attributable to the electricity generation sector. Globally, that share is somewhat similar. What you see coded in red as energy actually picks up a whole bunch of other sectors, right? Because energy, obviously, energy and energy production is an input into a variety of other sectors like transportation and energy use in buildings. And that's actually one of the themes that we see, which is overall electrification of the variety of energy sources used in other sectors may in fact be one of the keys to getting decarbonization to within acceptable limits. So the basic point here that I wanted to communicate is that in the spirit of picking some of the highest impact actions that we collectively can take, decarbonizing the electricity sector has an extremely high payoff for humanity in the context of climate change. So why is that important, and how does that work? As we'll talk a little bit more about cost in just a second, cost of delivering renewables and why that's important. But when we think about decarbonizing the electricity grid, a lot of times colloquially, what you'll hear, including in the news, is something that sounds like an unlimited positive, right? Which is that the share of renewables is increasing exponentially. And it's being driven at this point, not only by policy mandates in different places that are trying to incentivize decarbonization, but also by the inexorable logic of cost, which is that at this point, renewables are the cheapest form of generation. So they are being adopted widely in a variety of places. However, we're going to take a look. This is modeling that comes from a theoretical portfolio of generation in Minnesota, but the principle is broadly applicable. And the point is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to construct a grid entirely out of renewables. So let's take a look at layering on some different forms of generation. So this red is intended to depict electricity demand in the industry. We call it load. And load is fairly predictable on a daily basis. So on the axis over here, on the horizontal axis, what you see are days, right? So load is predictable. Every day our demand for electricity rises, typically reaches a peak sometime in the evening, and then overnight starts to go down. And then the next day we get up and do it all over again. We might, in this theoretical grid environment, have some very predictable form of renewable generation. In this case, it's hydropower. Hydropower certainly does vary, but it tends to vary seasonally rather than individually on a day-by-day basis. And so it is extremely predictable, certainly has some characteristics that are very similar to baseload generation. And so that's really, although this is stylized in this modeling exercise, that's really how it layers into this grid environment. We're going to layer on top of that solar. And what you'll see is that solar has some characteristics in concert with load, which is that it's fairly predictable and reaches a peak. Now, you'll note that the peak for solar is typically offset from the peak for load. So, you know, what happens when you add more and more solar to a grid environment is that you layer in more and more generation, but it's all in the same hours of the day, and typically will reach a peak of maximum irradiation around noon, right? Which is typically not where peak load is in most grid environments. But the good thing about solar is that it's broadly predictable. Of course, there's cloud cover. Of course, there are entirely cloudy or stormy days, but every day the sun comes up, every day the sun goes down. We're going to add on top of that something that has a completely different load profile, which is that of wind. And what you see about wind is that it is can be an enormous source of generation potential, right? So you see the peaks here are well in excess of load. But obviously there are entire days that really the wind is not blowing. And that really points to the fundamental problem with trying to construct a grid purely out of renewable resources, which is that you've got this white space over here where my cursor is right now, where there's really no generation at all. And you've got here an excess of generation. And typically in today's grid, if you tried to construct this, what you would have to do is to fill this gap with fossil fuels. And you would, what is known as curtailment, you would curtail in this area, which means that you would simply send a signal to those assets, particularly the wind, to say, shut it down. I'm not taking that power at this time. So what you've got are, invested in capital resources, namely the wind plants, that are not running because the grid, the load, simply at this time cannot take them. So that really leads me to the point, I think, that Rudy initially set us up to discuss so nicely, which is although we're kind of framed by the really positive and somewhat remarkable news based on, at this point, decades of investment, that renewables are the cheapest form of generation and set us up for a future that includes a significant amount of decarbonization, we're not really able to construct a grid with firm dispatchable power, which means that you've got power when you need it. At the points that you need it, you're not able to create that with a grid constructed purely out of renewable resources. There's intermittency, and its sort of concomitant reaction is curtailment. When there's too much power, we have no choice but to curtail that power. Now, this equation is already true. We started out by saying that renewables are the cheapest form of generation. Let me just give you a data point on that. We see auctions clearing globally at as low as $10 the megawatt hour, right? And in some places where there's excess generation, you're even seeing negative pricing due to renewables, so that basically the market clearing price for renewables is zero. And so in that context, renewables are certainly cheaper than carbon intensive sources of power. But as we just saw in the slide previous to this, that doesn't make a grid run. And so what we really need to do is to make this equation the actionable one, which is renewables plus storage to be cheaper than the price of carbon intensive electricity generation. The DOE has recognized this fact, and what you see on the right-hand side of this page is a real commitment from this administration and from Secretary Granholm to create market mechanisms to drive the price of long duration energy storage down by 90%. And that's an earthshot announced by the DOE in hopes of making the equation that's now fully on this page, which is renewable energy plus storage, to be cheaper than carbon intensive sources of electricity. So I've kind of given you my preview here and kind of stolen the thunder, but what is the solution to the dual problems of the need for decarbonization being driven by cheaper and cheaper renewables, and the need to construct a grid environment that provides electricity to consumers that is firm and dispatchable, certainly, but also resilient, reliable, and results in affordable electricity to all of us as consumers. And in my view, long duration energy storage is the linchpin, is the solution to that. And I'm going to I'll keep the Malta advertisement to a bit of a minimum here, but I certainly want to make sure that you understand what my company is doing. As Rudy mentioned, I'm the CEO of a company called Malta. So I'll tell you about the history of that company in just a minute, but we are essentially focused on long duration energy storage. And you've got the headline numbers over here, 8 hours to 8 days. And I'll talk a little bit about long duration energy storage and the needs in the market in just a second. Grid scale, we are very much focused on the grid scale end of the spectrum. So not really looking at servicing at this point in time, commercial or industrial customers, residential customers, et cetera. We're really focused on a 100 megawatt application. If I were to kind of give you one point about the technology, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in just a second, all the underlying components are commercially mature and they are technically mature. So that's sort of the Malta system, and that's the company. As a company, we spun out from X in 2018. X is Google's moonshot factory, and many of you may be familiar with X. The original technical insight was the brainchild of a professor at Stanford named Bob Laughlin. He is a physics professor, a physicist. And his original technical insight was that you could take a heat pump on the charge side, a heat engine on the generation side, put thermal energy storage in the middle in the form of molten salt on the hot side, and a commodity antifreeze fluid on the cold side. And if you integrated that system, what would result would be low cost, long duration energy storage. He worked on his idea, and in 2015, that idea entered X, Google's moonshot factory. From 2015 to 2018, they de-risked the idea, scoped it, etc. You may have heard about X that they essentially focus on ideas and test them to the point of failure. And actually, famously, they celebrate failure and have celebrations when projects of theirs fail within X. Malta was an idea that refused to fail at X, and in 2018, they made the decision to spin the company out as an independent entity. That's where my path crossed theirs. I put that original business plan and syndicate of investors together. I led the spin out, and I have been the CEO of the independent company ever since. And I promise that the picture on the right-hand side of this page is really the only thermodynamics joke you'll hear in this entire talk. But obviously, we talk about this being something like a refrigerator on steroids. The best known example that I can give you of a heat pump, I often get asked, can you give me an example of a heat pump or a heat engine? Because these are the two sides of the charge and the generation cycle. The best known example I can give you of a heat pump would be something like a refrigerator or an air conditioner. And you have the same dynamic happening on the Malta side, on the charge side. So let's talk a little bit about what Malta does, what Malta's technology does. Like all energy storage, the primary aspect of Malta's technology is to time shift power. So you take power at a time where its marginal value is very low. For example, when there's excess generation, the marginal value of every electron is very low, power is very cheap, there's a lot of it, it's plentifully available. At those times, you charge the system and you hold on to it. You sit in a state of charge until that marginal value of electricity becomes very high. And then when that marginal value is very high, you discharge the electricity, you generate electricity back onto the grid. All storage does that. You take power, and you know this from your own mobile devices, you take power and then you use it when you're no longer connected to the grid. Now, in the case of Malta, we add a sort of extra layer of important services to the grid, which is that when you look at a Malta system, it looks and feels like a traditional thermal asset. Traditional grid environments globally were really architected on the basis of providing resiliency and reliability based on generation by fossil assets. Not only is it that they're firm and dispatchable, but they also provided a lot of services to the grid that essentially came along for free, right? Rotational inertia, for example, that really supports grid frequency. It's not, in most jurisdictions, a traded commodity. It's not like you can say, oh, rotational inertia is worth this and I'm going to get paid this amount for it. In years past, in the traditional grid environment, it just came along for free, along with all kinds of large rotating equipment that were essentially the source of generation on the grid, from coal plants, steam plants, gas plants, etc. In an environment where you increasingly have a lot of intermittency, a lot of renewables, a lot of fossil assets are being retired and not replaced by other fossil assets, one of the really difficult aspects that grid operators are having to face is the erosion of some of those traditional services. provided by fossil assets. And so if there was only one thing I wanted you to remember about the Malta technology, it's this, which is that like all storage systems, we time shift power. But in addition to that, we provide the kinds of operability and ancillary services that have traditionally been provided by fossil assets. So we enable renewables and do so while providing resiliency and reliability, just like traditional fossil assets did to the grid. So what you see is that, it looks very much, if you were driving by a Malta plant, which is what you see on the rendering on the right-hand side of this slide, if you were driving by a Malta plant, you'd be hard pressed to see from the outside that it was really very different from other power plants that work on the grid today. We've got two powertrains, a charge powertrain and a generation powertrain, both with turbo machinery, a compressor and a turbine on a single shaft, grid connected, synchronous to the grid on both charge and generation. Really, some really important characteristics. Very much like flow batteries and pumped hydro storage, you can extend duration very cheaply. So the duration, the energy in the Malta system is the molten salt and the antifreeze fluid. And both of those are the cheapest part of the system. So in order to extend duration from the, call it baseline 10 hours, all you'd need to do is add some salt, add some coolant, and you can even do that ex post facto, meaning you build a plant today at 10 hours and then 10 years from now decide you need an extension in duration. It's relatively easy to come back and extend that duration. And not only is it easy from an engineering or design point of view, it's relatively cheap. It's the cheapest part of the system. In addition to that basic decoupling of power and energy, Malta kind of goes one step beyond the flow battery profile by also decoupling charge from generation. So because the charge powertrain and the discharge powertrain are actually physically different from each other, it's relatively easy to have a very asymmetric charge and generation profile. And so, for example, in the case of a classic diurnal cycle, when you're firming solar, what you really want to do is to charge in, call it 6 to 8 hours, and then discharge for the rest of the day. You can do that in the case of the Malta system, having the asymmetry with fast charge and a relatively longer discharge. Or you can do it alternatively. We've heard of use cases where there's a desire to do a long, slow trickle charge to kind of always be in charge mode, and then to discharge very quickly to take advantage of, for example, price spikes within the market. And you can do that, again, asymmetrically, because the charge and the generation are on physically different powertrains, which means that you can adjust their rated power differently. So the basic idea behind Malta and the right way to think about it is that there's a charge unit, a storage unit, and a generation unit, all of which can be varied relatively simply and using the same kind of building blocks on the Malta side of the house to deliver customized solutions to the customer side of the house. So that flexibility in terms of configuration is a key part of what we think is the value proposition at Malta. Green heat. Now, there is no doubt that one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors is the industrial heat, industrial process heat. And one of the benefits of the Malta system is that there is waste heat from the system, and it all comes out at one point. So it's relatively easy to harness. It is relatively high quality. It's about 120 C. And on a combined heat and power basis, if you're harvesting the heat as well, the overall round trip efficiency of the system goes up to above 90% because a huge amount of the waste from the system, the loss in efficiency is in waste heat. So let me give you some baseline numbers, just to give you some headlines. I mentioned that we're sort of 8 hours to 8 days. We are not, and don't imagine that this technology is really appropriate for seasonal firming. And then grid scale. I mentioned that we're really focused on 100 megawatt part of the bulk power system. And on a low cost basis, we do expect to get to at or below $100 a kilowatt hour. So let me stop for a second to address kind of what I think of, the need for storage in terms of the future grid. And I want to address that in the context of both duration, size, scale, and operability profiles or ancillary services. which is that if we're going to get to anywhere near the kind of numbers we think we're going to need in terms of renewables, the amount of storage that we are going to need collectively here in the United States and then globally is absolutely immense. And my basic view of that is that it's a very, very big table that is going to need quite a lot of segmentation among technologies to service different needs. You're going to have to service commercial industrial customers, potentially residential customers, certainly bulk power. We're going to need duration to firm solar in the, call it, 12 to 16 hour range. We're going to need duration to firm wind. Our modeling shows, which is anywhere from, call it, 20 to 45 hours. And over time, as we see increasing electrification of what are today summer peaking grid environments, and as we convert heat, for example, to electric systems, we're going to see those summer peaking systems, winter peaking systems. And so we're going to, in addition to all of that, also need seasonal storage. So the bottom line from my perspective is it's a very big table, and we're going to need a lot of different technology. And so at this point, we really think about our sweet spot being here. But I say this, fully cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of sweet spots around the table. So just keep that in mind as you assess the competitive landscape. A critical part of our strategy from day one has been that we have commercially and technically mature components. And so what does that mean in the context of how we think about ourselves, our investors, our partners? And what it has enabled for Malta is the ability to really get to market as quickly as possible by magnifying and multiplying our impact by using partnerships as opposed to having to invent the wheel, kind of cutting from whole cloth ourselves in every context, both on the technical side and on the commercial side. So if we think about the underlying technical components, they really, in my view, fall into three categories: heat exchangers, turbo machinery, and balance of plant. And the balance of plant in our plant is really commodity items, largely pipes, pumps, tanks, and valves. And what we've really done is to team up with world-class companies that have really aligned themselves with us in a variety of ways, including in terms of being investors in the company and sitting on our board. For example, Alfa Laval, the world's leading manufacturer of heat exchangers, listed on the Stockholm Stock Exchange and headquartered in Sweden, is an investor in the company from its very early days, sits on our board as well. They are our technical partner on the heat exchanger side, really creating a compact heat exchanger that is sort of custom designed for our application in terms of cost and performance. Siemens Energy is making our turbo machinery. And in the same context, really drawing from an extremely wide product line that they already have on the compressor and the turbo machinery side. And although the Malta system is light on, people talk about R&D as though it's one thing. What I'd say in the case of Malta is that we're heavy on the D, but very, very light on the R by design. There's very little true science risk, true technology risk within the Malta system. It's really about drawing on components that are well understood, already designed, have been used at this scale in power plants across the world for decades. And so what we've done is to partner with those companies that have that experience in each of those components to really help us ultimately with the delivery strategy that is focused on commercial scale and commercially financeable projects. And what you see on the right-hand side of this is really the components that make projects financeable, ultimately to get to project financing as quickly as commercial project financing as quickly as possible between the offtake, insurance, and then the performance guarantees and warranties that you would need to deliver with a system to ensure that it's fully financeable. In addition to the technical partnerships, we've also put together a number of commercial partnerships with Magtel, a renewables developer in Spain, with whom we have a joint venture developing a number of projects, with Bechtel, one of the world's largest construction companies. We have a partnership that's been publicly announced with them, also targeting commercial projects. And then a number of other commercial customers with whom we have efforts of various kinds, all of which also have been publicly announced. And I'm happy to talk about those if that is helpful. But the basic point is that our goal from day one was to try to accelerate our time to market, taking advantage of the fact that we're not proving any electrochemistry, we're not proving any physics, we're really taking products that are well known, well understood, and exist, and implementing them in a different application than they've been used in before in order to create a new product. And in our view, the best way to do that as quickly as possible was really to create an investor and partner syndicate that goes well beyond capital. So here I've identified the partners that I mentioned before on the technical side, Alfa Laval, Siemens, and Proman. But in addition to that, we've got owners that range from sort of true financial investors to visionaries in a variety of areas across a number of different rounds of capital. So what are the challenges at Malta today? And I want to list a few of them and then go through some use cases, et cetera, so you can see how the technology is deployed. So Malta is a scale technology, right? So it is, turbo machinery itself likes to be big. And we believe very strongly, and the market pull is very strong, that the kind of bulk power grid scale electricity storage is a massive need. And it really speaks to the sweet spot of Malta's technology. Now, what does that mean? That means that the capital requirements are large. We're talking about large infrastructure projects of hundreds of millions of dollars with long time scales. Now, a lot of what I'm saying on this page is not unique to Malta. A lot of clean tech, hard tech have the same kinds of characteristics with high capital requirements, long time scales. And then importantly, the customers are risk averse, right? So rightly speaking, utilities tend to be risk averse because they're looking to protect their ratepayers. And we can say very much that we understand where they're coming from. All that being said, the ability to deploy innovative technology, when you combine these three kind of characteristics that are in the background between high capital requirements, long time scales, and risk-averse customers, that really make customer adoption a very high touch and long process, lead to certain challenges that we as a company have to deal with. And then really important, and one that keeps me up, sort of at all times, is that market mechanisms globally are still developing. So the traditional market mechanisms in grid environments have largely, been a historical legacy where assets were really in silos. So you have, tariffs that pertain to transmission assets. You have tariffs that pertain to generation assets. And traditionally, in deregulated markets, there's quite a barrier between transmission and generation. And one of the complexities of storage is that it crosses these silos, right? So it can actually act as a non-wires alternative to transmission build. Certainly it acts as generation. And the ability to value stack across each of these different areas is ultimately going to be a critical part of making sure that the value of storage is recognized. And today, the markets are not there yet. You've certainly had, there are tailwinds here. We've certainly had regulatory bodies here in the United States and in Europe recognize that new mechanisms are needed to value storage. Many of you may know FERC Order 841, which was an attempt by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission back, I think, in 2018, to ensure that the traded markets recognize that value. That is still a developing story, right? This story is not done. And what we're seeing is that regulators and policymakers understand this, but market design takes time. And so we need to have the ability to value stack across all the different values that storage provides to the market. Let me just, I'm not going to read these numbers, but direct you towards a report that was put out at COP26 by the Long Duration Energy Storage Council, which is a global group that was just started last year. Malta is a founding member, and the founding members include technology companies like ourselves who are creating emerging and innovative technologies to solve the problem of long duration storage. And they also include large global companies ranging from OEMs to financial investors to strategic customers, et cetera. And McKinsey acts as a thought partner, a technical partner to the Long Duration Energy Storage Council. And the report, the first report the council put out was, as I mentioned, launched at COP26, and there will be an update to this at COP27. But what you'll see here is an extremely large total addressable market. Now, obviously, the overall numbers are enormous, both in terms of capital deployed as well as power capacity. But what you'll see is, although 2025 looks small relative to some of these numbers that occur in the future, in utility terms, 2025 is tomorrow, right? Because if you're going to really have to commission projects in 2025, you're going to have to start building them next year. So even the nearest term numbers, right, which is 30 to 40 gigawatts of long duration storage needed by 2025 is an enormous number. So my point was not really to kind of read you through all these numbers, but to the extent you're interested in long duration storage, this report that was put out in 2021, Net Zero Power Long Duration Energy Storage for a Renewable Grid, is absolutely fascinating reading. And I direct you to the website of the Long Duration Energy Storage Council. And then in the context of a large addressable market, Malta, actually our focus areas are outlined in blue. We're very focused on North America and on the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. And we have a number of ongoing commercial efforts, both in terms of true project development, as well as bilateral negotiations with a number of customers, really aiming to have our first projects commissioned in that time frame. So let me talk a little bit. I know we have only 20 minutes left of the kind of prepared aspects, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I certainly don't want to go over that. So I want to talk a little bit about what are the use cases that we see as driving the commercial adoption of a technology like Malta. And so we've talked about a couple of these already. I'll give you some more details in the next couple of pages. But we certainly, from renewables, I'll talk about solar, I'll talk about wind. A really interesting driver for near-term commercial adoption is repurposing coal plants. So one of the dynamics that we see globally is that coal is shutting down everywhere. In some cases, it's shutting down because of law. So Germany announced in 2019, I believe, a coal exit law, which mandates that Germany exit coal by 2038. But in other places where there is no kind of legal reason to exit coal, we're seeing coal plants shut down anyway. And it's because of the kind of inexorable market logic of the fact that coal is expensive relative to new generation. So one of the issues with shutting down coal plants is the dislocation of that workforce. And one of the most resonant places, I'll talk about it a little bit more in just a minute, that we're getting a lot of customer traction is that if you look at a Malta plant, as I already told you and showed you a little earlier, it looks just like a traditional fossil asset. So there is a real opportunity to take a coal plant, to put a Malta plant in its place and repurpose both the kind of site as well as the point of interconnection into a new clean power plant that enables renewables in that jurisdiction. And a critical part of that importance of that strategy is in preserving the incumbent workforce. And in a lot of places, we're talking not only about the jobs that inure to the people who actually work at the plant, but also the entire tax base and economic activity in small towns can be dependent on the operation of a coal plant. So really shutting down that plant results in enormous dislocation. And if we are to be successful at creating a just transition, a transition that, you know, brings people forward with us into a greener economy, having strategies to really protect and preserve workforces is a critical part of that. And that's one of the places that we find ourselves having a lot of traction and resonance. The third use case I'll talk about is one that actually is a little interesting, actually, in my view, in the sense that traditionally I really see long duration storage generally sort of being a replacement for gas peakers. In this case, we did a study with the DOE and Luminant, which is Vistra's subsidiary in Texas, looking at optimizing the use of gas peakers, actually. So integrating a Malta plant with a gas peaker. And then really important, industrial decarbonization, which is to use green heat in industries such as lumber, agriculture, district heating, et cetera. And remember, in all cases, as I said, you know, the Malta system provides ancillary services really commensurate with that of a traditional fossil asset. So let's take a look at kind of a very classic, somewhat simple case of firming renewables. So if you look at the left-hand side of this page, the thick black line is what you'll see is the duck curve, essentially. It's net load. There certainly is the widespread deployment of lithium ion to shave those peaks. But essentially, the large part, the belly of the duck, so to speak, is primarily being served with natural gas. The yellow here is solar, the blue is wind. This is California. It says today, this is a little dated, I think it's from 2020, if I'm not mistaken. So this is essentially what that looks like. And what you have is already storage assets being deployed. They're primarily lithium ion. They've got a duration of, call it 2 to 4 hours. You know, being used to shave peaks. It's charging over here and discharging over here. Now, this is modeling from CAISO as to what happens in 2030, where you have 60% renewables. And what you'll see is that thick black line, which here looks like this, all of a sudden really starts to look like this. And when you have renewables, in this case solar, no longer just providing a portion of serving a portion of the net load, but really is able to be at 60%. There's an enormous amount of solar. And of course, the problem with solar is the more and more solar you add, you're stacking it on the same hours of the day, right? You can't by itself get solar at different times of the day. And what you really start to see is the need for longer periods of discharge, which is the key behind long duration storage, not really servable by 2 to 4 hour types of instruments. You're really looking at the need for anywhere from 10 to 15 hours. But if you can have 10 to 15 hour storage, what you're able to do is during the peak generation from solar, really take it to charge, and then overnight, you're really able to have an asset that's able to discharge the rest of that period. So firming solar is kind of a no-brainer. It's a really easy use case. It's one that we expect to see gaining in traction, and one that the modeling really supports the fact that very attractive opportunities for kind of, call it 8 to 24 hour energy storage. This is just a quick statement on cost. This is can be a difficult chart to read, so let me walk you through it really briefly. This axis is actually a reverse axis. So what we're saying, this is LCOE, it is not LCOS, it's the levelized cost of electricity, so the actual electricity price to the customer. This axis, the x-axis, is charging cost. So what we're saying is, as you move towards the right, the cost of charging is asymptoting towards zero. It's getting lower and lower. And as you see, Malta plus solar, or lithium ion plus solar, is really competitive, Malta plus solar, at the $10 mark, anywhere to the $20 mark, with this price being US natural gas, right? Call it the $40 to $65 the megawatt hour. And of course, in Europe today, this range is sharply higher, right? Given the war in Ukraine and Russian gas. So the whole point is that solar plus Malta is competitive with US natural gas. Let me take a quick look at another case, which is firming renewables, but looking at wind, right? So in this case, this is just an example. These are all model results. We're looking at a little over a gigawatt plant, wind farm with 100 megawatt Malta system. We're really able to achieve 96% of the time green electrons with 24 hours of Malta storage, right? So from relative to a classic solar plant where you're really looking at, call it, you know, if you're charging for 8 hours, you're discharging for 16. With wind, the need for discharge duration goes up. In this case, it goes up to 24 hours. Our modeling shows typically that that's going to be somewhere from 20 to 40 hours. So what you're able to do is deliver renewable power 96% of the time. Let's take a look quickly at repurposing a coal plant. We did a study with Duke Energy. The press release on the right gives you a sense of when it was announced. It's public, and we actually will be filing a final report here shortly. And the point here is, as I mentioned, we're integrating an incumbent workforce, reusing the point of interconnection and potentially other site characteristics. The ability to reuse other site characteristics depends a lot on what's at the site, what kind of site it is, the age and condition of the equipment, et cetera. But reuse of any components really leads to a lower cost project. And really important in a grid environment, and it's borne out by the modeling that we've done with Duke on their system, is that the kinds of ancillary services provided at that particular point in the grid are very similar to traditional fossil assets, which, if you think about the architecture of a grid environment in which there traditionally has been a coal plant at that point, that's really what the grid is modeled on, right? So being able to provide that kind of operability profile can be extremely attractive in that point. We did another study with Vistra, with Luminant in Texas, with the Southwest Research Institute. And what we were really looking to do is to couple a gas peaker plant in the context of the Texas grid environment, which, again, as many of you may know, is an extremely volatile grid environment with pricing that is extremely variable because of high renewables penetration. And coupling with a Malta plant enables that gas peaker to optimize its environmental performance. It minimizes emissions actually by enabling the plant to operate at design point. And it optimizes the economic performance of the asset as well, which really the kind of constant turning on and off is an extremely expensive proposition, which we're able to help avoid. Green heat. You know, since this is kind of just a stylized rendering, but I mentioned to you before that this is the air loop in the middle, and what you see is that power comes out of one side on the generation side, but almost all the waste from the system is in rejected heat, which goes through a heat rejection heat exchanger and is dumped out into the ambient. It's very easy to harness. And if we can harness that heat for industrial or district heating applications, then the combined heat and power efficiency actually at that point goes up to above 90%. So it's an extremely efficient system if the heat can be used as well. So I think that is the last of my prepared comments here. So I was happy to kind of make sure that I got through all of them. I'm going to stop sharing. And Rudy, I turn it back over to you, not knowing how you typically like to moderate the Q&A.
Well, very good, Ramya. Thank you. And extremely a number of topics that I'm sure there'll be some questions raised. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'd like the students to ask the questions first. Please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then go ahead with your question. So students.
I have a question. This is Carol Obando Dursine. I'm a current student in the Energy Systems Engineering program, and my capstone project is actually on BESS, but it's different. And I appreciate your talk very much so, but my focus is more on the shorter duration. So the 2 to 4-hour range, and because I'm more focused on the distribution side, and it seems like Malta is more supporting the transmission. So I was just curious if you recommend any particular resources to be able to, understand the shorter duration batteries. I definitely have availed myself of all the national labs and the information that they have. And I know the Storage Futures project, and there's a number of articles there touching upon different segments, but I was just curious if you have any recommendations. And the second part of my question, the second question I should say, is you quickly alluded to what's happening in the Ukraine, the war, and the impact that that's having on prices. And again, tied to the NREL, I was looking at the price of lithium ion battery systems projected to decrease greatly by 2024. But that report came out last year. So I don't know like what you think the impact will have on the supply chain and bringing those prices down of lithium ion batteries. And that's it.
Both great questions, Carol. Thanks. I'll try to make sure that I get to all parts of them, and please remind me if there's a portion that I leave out. So I think on the first question with respect to sources, I mean, the national labs are a terrific source, right? I actually highly recommend the national labs and all kinds of projects that all of you are doing. So make sure you check those out. The other thought I had there, Carol, was the Storage Association, the Industry Association for Storage, which covers short duration, long duration, all storage technologies, used to be called ESA, Energy Storage Association. In 2021, that organization merged into ACP, the American Clean Power organization, which was the former AWEA, the former Wind Industry Association. So I would say ACP. I just tell you that history in case you're looking up some of their publications and other folks, you may find them under ESA, which is the Energy Storage Association. But certainly the Industry Association for Storage in the United States is a terrific source of information about all kinds of storage. So they definitely cover the entire industry, both short and long duration, as well as you mentioned, you're focused more on the kind of distribution side, while Malta is focused on the transmission end of the grid scale deployment. So check out ACP, American Clean Power. In terms of Ukraine and the pricing of lithium ion, it's a fascinating question. So we, like everybody else, as you can imagine, have been very focused on looking at the impacts even before the war in Ukraine, right, of supply chain disruptions, as well as cost and price increases that we're seeing for a variety of technology deployments. And what we were seeing, and although you're right, that certainly, lithium ion pricing is anticipated, has been anticipated now for a long time to decrease on a very sharp basis, which means that as a new technology, as an emerging technology, we're very focused on making sure that we understand the pricing of lithium ion because they're a natural competitor, right? Now, we think, relatively speaking, we're not actually serving the same duration that lithium ion is serving, and there's going to always be a place for lithium ion. That said, it's an important mark in the market. So we monitor that pricing very closely. So even before the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions of various kinds globally had resulted in projections from lithium ion increasing by about 15%, are the numbers that I've seen from today's levels. And that increase staying at that somewhat higher level for quite a bit of the foreseeable future. So not kind of continuing with their fast declines after that. Now, the war in Ukraine, I would say it's only been 6 weeks from a supply chain perspective. I believe that not all the data and the working throughs of how much disruption there's going to be from a global perspective have been worked through, and none of the projections we're seeing today fully account for everything that's going to happen in the market with respect to Ukraine, but I think you're going to see an intensification of that dynamic. And so, stay tuned is what I can say on that front.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Good question, good answer. And another question from students? Unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask the question, please.
Hi, this is Abney Sonkar. I am a mechanical engineering student. I'm working on PCMs as well, energy storage systems. So my question for you is, first of all, it's a great presentation. It's good to see companies, because I work in this field, with my research in this field, and I see these companies coming up. It's great. My question is, so the Malta plants are as a standalone system, or they're just supporting the traditional power plant during the off-peak time, like in the sense, like you store the energy and then you provide electricity for the conventional power plant? That's my first question. So.
Mm-hmm. So Malta's system is a standalone storage system. So we're agnostic as to the source of power, but we don't combust anything within our system. We do not generate if we don't have power coming in. So we need a source of electricity. Now that can be directly coupled with a renewable plant, for example, wind or solar behind the meter. It could be simply grid connected. So we see a lot of interest from utilities for just grid connected storage to relieve congestion, to provide capacity and other services to the grid, not necessarily directly coupled or directly located on the site of a wind or solar project. But direct coupling is certainly a possibility, including with conventional assets. One of the most interesting inbound inquiries we got actually was from a nuclear plant, which operates in a must-take mandate for renewables. So the nuclear plant was suffering from negative pricing. And so if you can imagine yourself as the operator of a nuclear plant, right? Nuclear likes to operate in a very kind of stable fashion. Ramping up, ramping down are very difficult for a nuclear plant to do. And so what they were doing was absorbing negative pricing in order to just maintain the stability of operations. And one of their interests was in evaluating whether direct coupling, essentially, being kind of behind the meter with a nuclear plant, would be a use case for Malta, sort of to absorb that excess electricity when they would otherwise be suffering from negative pricing. So I hope I'm answering your question. We're sort of agnostic where the power comes from, but there are a variety of places that we can and have been working with potential customers to take the power.
So you also involved in getting a dedicated solar plant on site, or is it just, again, as you said, you're just buying from the other solar plants, the electricity, the heat that you're trying to get? Yeah,
we certainly can take power from a solar plant, and some of the projects that we are developing would be behind the meter with a solar plant. So that's certainly a possibility.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, questions from students again. Unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask the question, please.
Hello, I'm Nick Kosher. I'm from the Energy Systems Engineering program. And just you said the whole process it was over 90% efficiency, which is that from like receiving from electricity from the grid to exporting electricity to a different site? Because I'm kind of confused on how basically how do you achieve that sort of, like, it seems like thermodynamically not possible.
For electricity to electricity, you're absolutely correct, right? So we really think about round trip efficiency as largely electricity to electricity. So that's the distinction I was making. So on an electricity to electricity basis, our efficiency would be closer to 55 to 60%. So, basically how much electricity comes in, how much electricity goes There are different definitions, and we can talk offline about being very specific about round trip efficiency versus overall system efficiency, whether aux loads and parasitics are included, et cetera. So there's some care that has to be taken to make sure that you're looking at efficiency in exactly the definitional way between technologies in the same way. All that being said, from an electricity to electricity basis, we expect our entitlement efficiency to be, call it 60 to 65%. And so in practice, to be between 55 and 60% efficiency. Now, when I said that the efficiency was over 90%, the particular distinction I was trying to make is that is on a combined heat and power basis, on a CHP basis, which means that if there happens to be an application in which you can harvest the waste heat from the system and use it, actually a lot of the losses that result in that 55% are really in the form of waste heat. So if you recover that waste heat and use that waste heat, the combined heat and power efficiency is what is over 90%. So Nicholas, you're absolutely correct. Electricity to electricity, much closer to 60%.
Good. All right, and a question from student. If not, I'm going to go to the chat box and read the questions that have been posed. Last call for student questions. Okay. All right, Ramya, here's a question in the chat box. Is there any IP protection with the Malta approach, or could anyone else do the same thing?
Oh, yeah, of course. Very good question. Excellent issue to raise in the context of any emerging technology. So yes, Malta has an extremely robust IP portfolio. Actually, one of the critical things is a lot of our priority dates actually go back to Professor Laughlin's work in the 2012 timeframe. We have been active in every phase of every incarnation of Malta, whether it was in that first period of Malta's genesis, while its time at X, since the time as an independent company, and continuing to generate IP that pertains not only to kind of overall system arrangement, but also to operability, controls, you name it. So yes, extremely robust IP portfolio.
Another question in the chat box from a former student from ESE, Nate Nichols. What are the environmental considerations for siting the Malta plant? Are there any concerns siting near residential or near urban environments for supporting CHP processes?
Yeah, excellent question. And certainly one that as we move to a more kind of distributed generation framework starts to become awfully important, right? So the Malta plant is 100 megawatts, 10 hours, and the overall land use requirements for that are on the order, call it, of 10 acres. We are continuing to work on getting that done. So I just wanted to be sort of upfront. While it certainly can be sited in dense urban environments, it still needs a lot of land. No more land than you would need for a large power plant, but certainly that's the kind of footprint that I'm talking about. One of the critical things, and I was myself a pumped hydro storage developer when I first kind of crossed paths with what was then Project Malta at Google X. And one of the most attractive things to me about Malta's technology is the flexibility in siting. It doesn't need any particular geologies like caverns or formations underground. It doesn't need any elevation differences. It doesn't need any particular requirement. And the flexible siting, to me, is really one of the most attractive points about ultimate scaling of the technology in terms of deployment. Now, let's talk for a minute about the environmental implications, because I think that was a focus of the question, which is a very good question about any new technology. And overall, the Malta system is very benign. Now, there are hot temperatures and cold temperatures, right? So our hot salts get up to 565 C, and our cold side gets as low as -60 C. There is big rotating equipment. There is, transformers on site. We'd be connecting synchronous to the grid. So I want to be clear that the kind of safety requirements that you'd have to have on site would be consistent with that of a large power plant. Now, there's no combustion within our system. All the different kind of fluids are pretty commodity fluids. So the salt is solar salt, what is called solar salt. It's the same salt that's used in concentrated solar plants. It's potassium nitrate and sodium nitrate. There are no chlorides within the system. When the salt always remains hot. And therefore, because of that, now there's a warm salt tank and a hot salt tank. But because of that, it always remains liquid. Now, if there is, for whatever reason, a breach or a failure such that the salt leaks out to the environment, what happens to it as it cools is that it hardens, it becomes solid. And so in that context, it's impossible to pump, certainly would be a big cost issue to kind of release it from the system. But overall, what you're not going to get is an unconstrained flow of molten salt threatening life and liberty nearby, right? It solidifies. And we know from the continuous operation of concentrated solar that that solar salt actually doesn't really degrade, and at the end of its life can be used as fertilizer. The coolant side is an alcohol-based coolant, and again, would just have to be subject to secondary containment and appropriate safety measures. But overall, and there's no combustion within the system, so we're not burning anything. And so in that context, the environmental footprint of the Malta system is extremely benign.
Thank you. A couple of very interesting questions in the chat box, Ramya. One from Joe. Given that there are 2 million electric vehicles in the US today and promises to be even larger by 2030, how much would it cost to duplicate the electric storage capacity of those vehicles with Malta technology? When excess solar is available, can you charge the vehicles and store the energy there?
Well, the use of electric vehicles for vehicle to grid operations is it's a fascinating topic, and it's certainly extremely interesting and something that I think there's a huge amount of interest in it. So if you look at a number of companies, they're focused on how do you really think about controlling that, right, and providing it, using those vehicles as demand response. First of all, so when there is, an overwhelming amount of demand, could you make sure that people are not charging at that time? And then when there's excess electricity, could you charge at that time? So dispatching that is actually a complex operation that requires quite a lot of attention. So I think you're putting your finger on an extremely interesting question, and one of the things I think about all the time is the complexity of the future grid relative to the grid of the past is something that we collectively have to wrap our minds around. So if you look at kind of a traditional power grid, call it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? What you had is basically kind of a unidirectional flow of kind of large generators, right? So you had fuel of some sort. It could be coal, it could be nuclear, it could be gas, it could be hydro, whatever. You had fuel of some kind that was put through a system that converted it into electric energy that was then pushed out onto the grid. That grid was operated in a merit order so that everybody looked at the marginal cost of the asset, and then those units were dispatched in a very logical manner. Now, the reason I'm going into all this is I think one of the most fascinating parts about the vehicle to grid kind of approach is that it is yet another way among all these other ways like distributed generation, storage, vehicles, etc., that is really taking a very simple kind of unidirectional flow and making it bidirectional, complex, distributed, and really quite different from the grid of the past, right? So think about operating that future grid when the resources you have are not just these large power plants that have fuel coming in, but rather there is electricity being generated by wind and solar that is sometimes going directly to the grid and going to the customers, but sometimes is being used to charge either electric vehicles in the manner that you're suggesting, right? There's excess electricity, they're charging electric vehicles only at those times, they're charging storage. Storage devices are bidirectional, meaning they take in electricity and they put out electricity. They're not taking in other kinds of fuel. And at the same time, you have more and more distributed resources. So you're no longer just dispatching a small number of very large assets. You're having to account for the generation and dispatch of a lot of very small assets that are kind of spread throughout the grid system. So I know I've taken your question in a bit of an orthogonal way, but I think it's really an interesting aspect of how we have to think about the functioning of future grid. And I think vehicle to grid applications are very exciting potential to use, including on the demand response side and including on as electricity storage. But we have to think really hard about how we're going to dispatch that in a way that's going to make the grid environment work.
Thank you. Again, a related question from Mark with EPRI. Do you see a combination of lithium-ion batteries with the Malta system, either locally or combined virtually, as a way to address different response time requirements and increase the effectiveness of the Malta system?
Absolutely. So I think hybridization is absolutely critical. And in the end, what the customers want are a solution, right? Not they don't want a technology, they want a solution. And the solution will include the need for things like black start, really fast millisecond response times, which lithium ion is really good at, which the Malta system is not, right? So our response times are going to be much more like a combined cycle gas plant. And so how are we going to create projects that provide to the customer the range of ancillary services they want? We're going to do that by hybridizing, including with lithium ion. So I think that question gets to the heart of what I was trying to say earlier in my talk, which is, this is a big, big table. We are having to solve a lot of issues. And energy storage can do a lot of it, but a lot of technologies bring different aspects and different characteristics to the table. And putting them together in creative ways is the way that we collectively are going to succeed at decarbonizing. So I'm a big proponent.
Okay. So Ramya, I have a related question that you mentioned, you're using a technology, thermal energy storage, which is one of the most reliable, most well-demonstrated ways to store energy. And you also have identified the different uses of battery, long-term storage, voltage regulation, frequency regulation, all the grid management that is capable of doing. Are you relying on the policies being opened up so that these revenue streams can be realized by companies like yours to take advantage and promised at low cost?
I love that question, Rudy, because I think it puts its finger on something that really keeps me up at night, which is that policy today does not enable that, right? And so today, the parties that can most capably take advantage of all of these different values are vertically integrated utilities, right? Vertically integrated utilities, they're not really looking to trade individual services, on a traded market, and there's no traded market for many of these services. And so vertically integrated utilities are a classic example of someone who can value stack today. That said, in kind of as we move along with regulatory change and market design change, absolutely, my answer to your question is absolutely, which is that I believe that market design has to account for the value created by all of these services and create a system in which the operator of these plants can get paid for those services.
Good. Thank you. Okay, some question from Didiran. Does Malta have a modular storage facility that is connected to existing conventional power generation systems?
No, we do not at the moment, but we have been studying that with some of our customers. So certainly some of the use cases I mentioned would be very much coupled with conventional fossil assets. So I mentioned a study we're finishing up with Luminant in Texas, looking at connecting to one of their gas peakers to optimize the operation of that facility as well as the emissions profile of that facility. We also have been working due to an inbound inquiry I mentioned with a nuclear plant that was looking to understand whether a storage system could really help them during times of negative pricing. So the specific answer to the question of do we have an operational plant is no, but we see a lot of possibility for this as a use case, for these kinds of things as use cases, and are studying them live with customers and actual facilities that they own.
Question from Alexander. Alexander Vincent. Just like the current grid scale generation, changes in load, both location and size, impacts finances and operations. With the increasing penetration of localized and unplanned renewable assets, mostly solar, how would this affect the use of long duration storage such as Malta?
Yeah, so I think this question is very tied into the concept I was just trying to describe of a future grid that is much more complicated, right? And distributed generation is obviously increasing. And as the question points out, a large amount of it has been solar. Sometimes it's rooftop solar, community solar, et cetera. And what you're going to see is a grid environment in which you're really going to see more and more kind of sit outside that traditional model of large scale generation assets, largely fossil, that are fired up, in response to a merit order. So it's one complicating factor of future grid, which is the pervasiveness of distributed generation. All that being said, I would say two things. One is that distributed generation adds a lot of resilience to the system, and so in my view ought to be encouraged and is an important part of how we decarbonize. And at the same time, the efficiencies of large scale, grid scale energy storage and generation are not going to be vitiated by distributed generation. We need both. We're going to need both. And there's sort of plenty of room for collaboration and constructing the grid of the future.
Okay. What is the lifespan of a Malta plant?
So we expect it to be very much like the design life of a traditional industrial asset, so call it 30 years. In general, though, relative to a gas plant, we have neither the temperatures as high as a traditional gas plant, nor do we have any combustion within the system. So we might actually expect less degradation throughout the Malta system than you would in a gas plant. But we're looking at a design life of something like 30 years. So with certainly maintenance and major maintenance built in, but nothing like the augmentation that you would need from a lithium-ion plant.
Okay. Question from Glenn here. Industry-sponsored resource adequacy studies focus on 1 hour in 10 years loss of load events caused by thermal plant outages. They do not typically account for low frequency, long duration drops in production of renewable power generation. So they don't justify investment in multi-day energy storage. Can you point any new resource adequacy studies which do demonstrate the need for investment in multi-day storage?
Yeah, we're increasingly seeing integrated resource plans that do call for long duration storage. And I can point you to a couple of them. I think Idaho, certainly if you want to reach out to me offline, I can get you some integrated resource plans that do. 2021 felt like 3 years in 1 year on this issue, which is that at the beginning of the year, a lot of customers, I think, were starting to think about storage and really were not necessarily persuaded about the need for long duration storage. Some of them had started modeling for integrated resource planning reasons about long duration storage. By the middle of the year last year, we saw some significant progress in terms of understanding the dispatch and the value of long duration storage in the context of, you know, ELCC type modeling in terms of IRP modeling, et cetera. And by year end, there were actual solicitations out for long duration storage by utilities. And so I can certainly give you examples. I'm sort of not losing track of specific names off the top of my head, but if someone wants to reach out to me afterwards, I can point you in those directions. And there's plenty of them going around now.
Okay. Question from Vincent. What does a project life and performance degradation profile look like compared to lithium technology? Also, are you planning smaller 1 to 20 megawatt pilot projects as proof of concept?
Yeah, so what does the life look like? As I mentioned, the design life, we're planning for kind of traditional 30-year industrial design life. And there's very little degradation throughout the system. So as I mentioned, there's no combustion within our system. Our maximum temperatures are less than 600 C. We know from the concentrated solar industry that the salt doesn't really degrade. You know, it really sits kind of, you know, it can sit, this is not degradation, but it can sit in a state of charge, losing about 1% of heat per day. And in addition to that, the salt itself doesn't really degrade over the lifetime in spite of the thermal cycling. So overall, we expect the maintenance profile of this to be relatively mild. And Rudy, I'm forgetting the second part of that question, which is
let me see if I can get back to that question there. Are you planning smaller 1
yeah.
to 20 megawatt pilot projects?
Yeah, so we're building a pilot right now. We expect it to be commissioned any day now, and we'll make a public announcement about that pilot. In terms of actual commercial, like grid scale projects, we do expect to start at the 100 megawatt range, and over time, certainly I think this technology is scalable down to as small as 10 megawatts. That said, I think the cost and revenue profile alignment around smaller projects for commercial scale deployment, I think are going to take longer to mature than the grid scale revenue profile, as well as cost profile. So.
Okay, the same gentleman, Vincent, has a commercial question. How would you describe your path to commercialization and bankability for your technology? How do you reassure project investors for 100 million plus deployments that your technology will not only function as expected, but that it will stand the test of time, given the number of companies, both small and large, have been in and out of the storage space?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually really on point, right? And one that is, it's an important question, not only for Malta, but to answer, but kind of everybody in this space is going to have to deal with that question. So I think it's a really important question. So how is it that what is our path towards commercial deployment? You know, I think there's a combination of factors that have to all align for success in this field. So certainly we have to have the right project partners. We think that having chosen and been successful at attracting and partnered with some of the world's class companies on the technology side, Alfa Laval, Siemens, Proman, ultimately an EPC firm, whether that's specifically in our case, we have a partnership with Bechtel, and it could be other EPC firms in other cases. Having the right project partners for project delivery is an absolutely essential part of that, right? From a customer standpoint, they're looking for safe hands in terms of deploying, and I think showing up with the kinds of strategic investors and partners that we have is an important part of credibility for that standpoint. Now, one of the advantages that the Malta technology has is that all the different subsystems have been deployed at this scale in power plants globally. And so there is not much doubt, either in our minds or any of our partners' minds, that the technology is going to work. So it's not the traditional case of proving out some electrochemistry or physics and then scaling up. In fact, all the equipment exists at this scale and bigger. You know, the largest concentrated solar plant, which has the same salt loop that we have, is the Dewa project in Dubai, is 700 megawatts. So this is not a scaling up issue for Malta as a technology. It's really an integration and application kind of play. And so in that context, I think it's a lot easier to get buy-in that the system works.
So Ramya, I think we're coming to the end, and I have a quick two-part question.
Yeah.
One is there something about the Malta technology, the thermal energy storage, that gives it an edge over other thermal energy storage capabilities?
Yes, so there are, you're right, Rudy, there are other thermal storage. So I think thermal energy storage is an extremely compelling profile relative to other kinds of storage. Now, within the thermal storage space, there are yet other companies other than Malta. So why do we think that we are going to be successful? Well, it's a combination of things. One is I think overall our system has been from the beginning designed and engineered to stay within kind of commodity limits that are today in existence. So we've chosen temperature, pressure, other system conditions that really put us in the range of kind of no exotic materials, no exotic minerals, no supply chain issues, common, plentiful kind of underlying materials that can be deployed by the best in class companies, right? So nobody's going to doubt that Siemens knows how to make turbo machinery or Alfa Laval knows how to make heat exchangers. So it's a combination of design parameters chosen for kind of ease of deployment combined with commercial partners who know what they're doing, technical and commercial partners who know what they're doing, all in combination to provide the services to the customer that are of increasing need in today's market. So it's not one thing, Rudy, that leads me to believe that Malta is going to be successful. It's a combination of things.
Yeah, and one last thing that I would like to point out, which is I think very, very creditable to the approach you're taking, is that the business of repurposing coal plants, you're basically bringing them heat source, could be, as you say, you're agnostic, and you're repurposing the use of the balance of plant system to generate electricity.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and the fact that you brought in so many partners, I think was a very good move.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, this is all the time we have. What a fascinating presentation, Ramya. Thank you again for presenting this to our students and the audience. And we will have, obviously we have a recording of this and we'll put this on YouTube and definitely show it to you before we put it out for the public. I'm hoping that we can get some sanitized version of your presentation. So if there are requests for your presentation, I could pass it on to others. So I really appreciate this presentation and thank you, audience. Next week we'll continue with another presentation by Revis James on energy and technology. And meanwhile, thank you, Ramya, for your
Thank you, Rudy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's great, Rudy.
Yes, excellent presentation. All right. Susan, you're still there, right?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Hang out for a couple minutes and have a little post.
Okay.
No, I'm asking. I don't know if you're busy or not.
Yeah, why don't we just hang around for a couple of minutes so we.
That's good.
Okay. All right. Wow.
I just removed everybody at the end. There was like 8 people. So hopefully they don't get mad at me.
Well, I think some of them are just kind of, they're dozed off and walking to
I
another
think they just
room.
walked away.
Yeah. Yeah, what a great presentation.
That literally could have gone for like another hour.
Yeah. I mean, she knew her stuff. And, you know, the other thing is she's made it a business success. I mean, she's brought all the right partners and lined up money and,
It was awesome. That was
Yeah.
that I think was the highest registration total and
Yes.
the highest attended. Because at one point we had 69 to 70 because some people came, some people dropped off. So probably close to 70 that actually were in there for the majority of the time. And I'm recording this. Let me stop recording.
Hey, it's saying